Greetings, comrades. History of Economic Thought 2, Hillsdale College. And today we're going to cover part 2 of our lecture on Soviet economic performance and the Soviet economic system. This is Marxist-Leninist economics. And today what I want to do in this lecture is tackle 3 questions. First of all, what was the economic performance of the Soviet Union? Secondly, why? Why didn't it work? Let's look at that in more detail, because what we'll see is that there was decline in this economy. And finally, I want to address the question of why did Western economists get it so wrong for so long? So let me start by summarizing Soviet economic performance. We had the NEP, and then we had the 5-year plans. That takes us up to World War II. They had an annual growth rate through much of that period of 4%, maybe. The method that they used was factor mobilization. But economic theory tells us that diminishing returns will set in. If you don't have technological advance, growth will slow and then it will stop. Well, what about technological advance and innovation? Well, as we've seen, the central planning system contains some obvious disincentives to innovate at the firm level. You don't gain from it, so why would you do it? The central planners themselves have obvious incentives to adopt new technologies, new products, and new methods. But that's influenced by their interests, their utility maximizers, and it's influenced by their knowledge. So the emphasis in this system will be on the goods that the leaders want. And it will be limited by the knowledge of the leaders. And the leaders can't get honest information from down below. Now keep in mind that the freer a market system is, the freer an economy is, the more there are people who are the freer a market economy, the more people are able to notice possibilities for growth and engage in entrepreneurship. In our economy, a janitor or a college student, anybody can become an entrepreneur if they suddenly say, wait, I've got an idea that nobody else has noticed. You don't have that in the Soviet system. Keep in mind, too, that our prices are ultimately driven by buyers. The thing that Menger pointed out is consumers. That's what we're ultimately serving. The Soviet tendency was to advance in military hardware, heavy industry and infrastructure that the leaders were interested in, and to do shoddy work in consumer goods and consumer services. And so the Soviet Union becomes famous or infamous for consumer shortages and for queuing, of course, standing in line. So the Soviets themselves, the Soviet people soon came to understand this. And one of the things they were very good at was producing. Soviet Union is just great at producing jokes. I think the greatest jokes in the world come from the Soviet Union. And here's an example. These are all jokes that the Soviets themselves came up with. Comrade, once we achieve full communism, you realize everyone will have their own personal airplane. Oh, well, that's great, comrade, but why would we want personal airplanes? Well, you see, suppose that you're in Sverdlovsk and you hear that the sausage suddenly becomes available in Chelyabinsk and you want to go get it. Or a man comes home unexpectedly from work and he finds his wife is having an affair with another man. He catches them together and he says, "You terrible woman, how could you do this? Don't you realize there's a line down there for butter and yours should be in it?" They're famous for shoddy consumer goods. Still, people will put up with that if it's an improvement over their previous life, which initially, or at least for some it is. And secondly, if they're convinced that they're building the future. And many people at the outset are thinking, okay, we're suffering, but we're building communism and it will be the best thing in the world once we get there. That's the initial thing. People flock to come from the United States and go to the Soviet Union to be part of this great experiment. Well, fine. It goes on, and you can guess what's going to happen. But we get to World War II. The Great Patriotic War, as they call it in Soviet Union. This is a tremendous shock to that country. It is a psychic shock. It is a physical shock. It is an economic shock. How many Soviets die in the war? 20 million people at least, maybe more, probably more. 7 to 8 million of those are military and the rest are civilians. This is just a tremendous bloodletting for them. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, one of the males who were alive in 1935, by 1945, 50% of them are dead. For females, 25% of them are dead. They died either from Stalin's purges or from the war. You know, contrast this with American dead. American dead in World War II, 407,300 military deaths. That's less, a little bit less than what the Soviets lost in one battle, Stalingrad. I mean, don't underestimate what a shock this is to them. The percentage of German casualties, I've seen various numbers on this, but the one that I see most commonly cited, that seems to be sound, is that of German casualties in World War II, 90% were inflicted on the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, this is a demographic shock, an economic shock, and a psychic shock. It just smashes them. And their post-war recovery is very difficult. But it resumes. They start their economy going back to work. Well, one thing they do, when they get to Germany, they loot factories. They take entire factories, pack them up, send them on trains, and send them back to the Soviet Union. They occupy East Germany. They occupy what becomes the communist bloc. East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and they maintain those as buffers against the West. They take Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and those are absorbed into the Soviet Union. Communist Yugoslavia stays independent, but it's communist, so they don't take it. And of course, Yugoslavia then becomes, communist Yugoslavia becomes famous for producing free market economists. Hillsdale people will understand that. At any rate, growth resumes at the end of the war, but it's slow. It's not a functional, good economy. Stalin dies, and Khrushchev replaces him. Khrushchev denounces Stalin in the Politburo and says, oh my gosh, this guy was homicidal. Not that Khrushchev wasn't. And Khrushchev institutes some mild reforms, but those are mostly failures. And he's ousted, and Brezhnev comes in. Brezhnev replaces Khrushchev and rehabilitates Stalinism, and there's no important economic change. So we have that 5-year system, the 1-year central plans that are going through this period. Well, it's hard to calculate, but we're pretty sure that by the early 1960s, per capita income in the Soviet Union was declining. It's going down. It's negative growth. That's certainly true by the 1970s. By the late 1960s, US spy satellites flying over the Soviet Union spotted food riots in cities, not in places like Moscow, but in the hinterlands. There were food riots from not enough food, from people just not getting enough to eat. So this is a failing economy. It's not stagnation, it's a failing, declining economy. Why is that? Why does this happen? Well, there's several things we can point to that are important to understand. First of all, we know that resource mobilization can't be a long-run growth strategy because of diminishing returns. And so they need technological advance. Technological advance is necessary. And frankly, the Soviet Union has had world-class mathematics, probably the best mathematicians in the world, world-class physics, theoretical engineering. They were very good, very strong. Their population is remarkably well educated. They teach this stuff to everybody. And technological advance is not a question of science, ultimately. It's a question of economic innovation and entrepreneurship. And when we get to that, they fail. Entrepreneurship is actually, you can get the death penalty for that. They execute people for these sorts of things. Those things they don't have. Okay, great. It is not raw knowledge that is important. We had a socialist who came here a couple years ago to Hillsdale and spoke. We had a debate, John Strinka from Indiana, and he said, it's simply coincidental that the rise of scientific knowledge and capitalism came at the same time. Capitalism doesn't cause growth, it's just science. Yeah, well, if that's true, John, then what happened to the Soviet Union? Why couldn't they innovate? They had the best science in the world. If you were right, the Soviet Union would have innovated, and they did not. In 2002, the year 2002, I was given a tour of what had been a factory, the main factory, for the Aerospace Electronics Ministry of the Soviet Union. They made radars and things like this for their aerospace industry, and it was used to be off limits to Westerners. When post-Soviet Union, I could get in, and they gave me a tour. And the guy's showing me around, he says, and there is our best, that's our best equipment right there. That machinery over there, and looking at all this stuff, that stuff's really good. By far the best quality we have. It was made in Nazi Germany. This is one of the factories that the Soviets packed up and looted and took to the Soviet Union. Now, I can understand, maybe you would go to NASA and you would find some old piece of equipment if it works, but I just can't imagine going to NASA headquarters or to one of the American aerospace firms and finding stuff that was made pre-World War II, that they're, are our best equipment. But that's the Soviet Union. Magnitogorsk, I mentioned, Magnitogorsk. Magnitogorsk. Russians are great at this. That means magnetic mountain. In the Urals, there is a mountain. It's basically just a big hunk of iron ore. And so, of course, the Soviets said, great, we're going to build a steel factory on top of that thing. And that's the name of Magnitogorsk, is the world's largest steel firm. They built this thing. Stalin, of course, they knew about economies of scale. They didn't know anything about diminishing returns. They skipped that part of economics. They didn't believe in it. Marx's idea, run the whole economy like one big factory. Diseconomies of scale, they don't know about that. Well, they built the world's largest steel factory on top of this mountain, or on this mountain. And it was, of course, top secret. They wouldn't let Westerners in. And towards the end of the Soviet Union, they realized they were behind everybody else. And so they opened it up, and they invited some Japanese steel executives to come in to advise them on how to modernize. And they said to these executives, look, Japan is really up and coming in steel. Here are your steel executives. How do we modernize this place? And the Japanese came in and looked at it, and they said, look at that stuff. We had no idea this stuff was still being used. That, like, you could turn this into a museum, maybe. You can't modernize this. You could tear it all down and build something new. This is so old-fashioned and backwards. Innovation failed. Saint Simon was telling us, we're going to put technical experts in charge, and then everything will be fine. We'll have this technocracy. We'll abolish private property and have technocracy. So why'd they fail to innovate? Well, this is why the Soviets said, comrades, have we reached communism, or will things get worse yet? Great. That's the first problem. How about another problem? Measurement. They failed in this, but what about measurement of output? And so remember our success indicator problem. The success indicator problem has both the ex ante and the ex post aspects to it. Ex ante, how do you specify your plan? And ex post, how do you measure compliance? What kinds of things can we use? So remember, we can't use prices, we can't use profits, and we can't use loss, because those are capitalist, market-oriented. So we have to use something else. We'll use physical stuff, physical measures. We're producing for need, not for profit. For people, not profit. We need 5 million nails. We'll make that our target. We need nails. So 5 million nails, and the factory says, great, we have to hit the target. Make teeny tiny little nails. Ah, that's not what we wanted. Okay, we'll make 5 tons of nails next time. Okay, well, great, there's your nail, giant spikes. That's the cheapest way to make, to hit the tonnage target. Well, that wasn't what we wanted, but in the end it doesn't matter because they all bend anyway, they don't work. Stuff is really shoddy quality because they can't specify every possible thing in the central plan. This is why my instructor went into a store, I'll remind you, and it was filled with women's shoes. All one style, all one size. They just said, make a whole bunch of women's shoes. That's the cheapest way to do it. It doesn't sell, and what do we care? It's not like we're going to take a loss. Again, less problematic in military industries because we know what a tank is, a Kalashnikov rifle, etc. How about agriculture? The success indicator problem in agriculture is really interesting because in agriculture, you can't really specify targets because agricultural output is so susceptible to weather conditions and things. And so what do? You know, might have just bad growing conditions. I know, input targets. We'll measure whether they're working hard enough. This is very common in bureaucracies. It's very common everywhere. People want to measure their activity, not their results. But they the Soviets in agriculture set targets for input use. Okay, well, we don't know if any crops will grow, but we can sure say, okay, at least hit the fertilizer usage target. Comrades, good news! We've exceeded the targets for fertilizer use. In some cases, they actually put so much fertilizer on fields that they started burning and killing the crops. They're rewarded for this. Sometimes they would take fertilizer and they dump it next to the field. Nobody's going out and, it's not like the Gus plan or somebody's going out and checking the field, for heaven's sakes. So they just use it. Just dump it, who cares? Pesticides, fuel. How much are you using? Use more, but hit the target. Good news, comrades, we've raised costs. It's built into the system. You think American bureaucracies don't do this when they're given assignments like that? At any rate, with respect to agriculture, this is why the Soviets knew comrade, how will this year's harvest be? Oh, average. It'll be worse than last year, but better than next year. Or another thing that the Soviets said was, Soviet agriculture, 70 years of bad weather. Keep in mind, Soviet Union could not feed itself. When I was giving you last semester your lectures on Adam Smith, remember, and the Corn Laws, that Ukraine is one of the major exporters of grain to Western Europe back in the 1700s and the 1800s. The Soviet Union couldn't feed itself. They imported grain, especially from the United States, also from Argentina, from Canada, and it was subsidized by the United States. Jimmy Carter, when we had President Carter, we had grain exports to the Soviet Union that kept them fed. Subsidized. So this is why a socialist, a capitalist, and a communist agreed to meet, but the socialist was late. Socialist says, I'm sorry, but I was standing in a queue for sausages. And the capitalist says, what's a queue? And the communist says, yeah, what's a sausage? Great. Okay, well, That's the Soviet story on measurement. What other problems do they end up with? What other reasons for their performance do we have? And this next one is important. We have only mentioned it in passing so far, but it's negative value added. And this one's a little bit tricky because we can't measure it really well. But here's the first question. What is profit? What is profit? Well, I was listening to a thing that was on some years ago. NPR had some public radio. It might have been one of the other public radio station networks, but had some sort of a debate or panel discussion going. And Jerry Brown, who then became governor of California, was on it, and they were talking about corporate profits. And Jerry Brown started out this way. He said, "Profit, that's when a company takes more than it gives." Well, really? So in other words, losses are when a company gives more than it takes? Okay, that's a totally wrong-headed and frankly stupid way of thinking of profit. Here's what profit is. Profit is, we'll define it this way, total revenue minus total cost. Okay, we know that. Great. Well, what does all this mean? Total revenue is price times quantity. That's the price times the quantity of stuff you're making. The price, if we followed Menger's argument, if we understand that, that price is the consumer valuation of these goods, how the consumer thinks of them, and then the quantity that the consumer is willing to buy. That's your revenue for the firm. And that would be, in a real simple case, the amount of labor you use and the amount of capital you use times the rental rate of capital and the wage rate of labor. It's your expenditures to make this stuff and any resources you buy. So if that's positive, if total revenue is greater than total cost, you make positive profit, it means that what you created was greater than what you cost the economy in terms of those resources, what they could have done elsewhere. Okay? You have created value. You took inputs worth that much and created something worth that much, and there's profit. That's what profit means. You've ended up with something more valuable than what you started with. Loss? Negative value added. Okay. That's what a loss is. It's negative value added, and it is clear that the Soviet firms often did this. They created negative value added. They took valuable stuff and made junk that nobody wanted. That's why you end up with a store that's got a whole bunch of shoes sitting in it that end up being thrown out because nobody wants them. We took perfectly good resources and labor and made stuff that gets thrown away because nobody wants it. Now, it's clear that Soviet firms often produce this stuff, but we can't see it. It's hard to see because we don't have prices. Still, those unsold inventories of consumer junk are evidence. And here's an even better example, I think. This one actually comes not from the Soviet Union, but from Romania, which copied, communist Romania, which copied the Soviet model under Nicolae Ceausescu. And they had a company that they called Electromotor. That was the pride of their economy. Ceausescu says, this proves that our system works. Because we produce, Electromotor produces electrical motors, and we sell those, but we sell them on the international market to Italy. And the Italians buy all of them they can get. They love this stuff. So see, we're successful. What do the Italians do with these motors? Every time they get one, they set it on a block, they take a sledgehammer, crack it open, rip out the copper wiring. Recycling. Man, that's a cheap source of copper for us. That's how screwed up their prices were in Romania. They were taking perfectly good capital, perfectly good labor, perfectly good resources, and making worthless junk And then the Italians are ripping it apart and taking some of the stuff out and recycling it. Now, why would firms persist in doing that, though? Now, and we also know American entrepreneurs do this too. American entrepreneurs will make mistakes. They'll make negative value added. And what happens when a capitalist entrepreneur does? They go bankrupt. How many Soviet firms went bankrupt in 70 years? 0. None. Bankruptcy might actually be one of the best features of capitalism. It shuts down mistakes. Firms go out of business might actually be a strength of our system because it doesn't happen there. They just keep producing stuff and stuff and stuff that is a loss, that is worthless. Great. Well, there's something more we can say about that. It brings up our next point, which is another reason for, another aspect of this, negative value added, and our fourth one is what we call the soft budget constraint. Okay, what's the soft budget constraint referred to? Well, let's go back to our little story here. I'm going to just call that the SBC. That term actually comes from an economist, Janos Kornai. Kornai is still alive today. I think he's still working. He is Hungarian economist in the in communist times. But he was actually able to get away with this kind of analysis. And he said that, look, socialist firms have a soft budget constraint. This explains why they can persist in negative value added activity. A capitalist firm has a hard budget constraint. So here's our capitalist firm. And it has the hard budget constraint. And what is that constraint? It is price times quantity. It's total revenue. The total revenue, it can't be spending more than that systematically. If it does over and over and over again, it goes bankrupt. They run out of money. That's their budget constraint. Their firm survival depends on sales. They cannot spend more than the revenue they earn from their sales of their product. Okay, what about a socialist firm? For a socialist firm with a soft budget constraint, they're subsidized by the state. In fact, they might not get that at all. They don't care. That's what their constraint is. So long as the state subsidizes them, they don't care. They can spend more than the revenue they earn from their product. Their product doesn't matter. That's what matters. And that's their incentive in a socialist system. The firm's survival doesn't depend on sales. It depends on subsidies from the state. Say, Oscar Lange, oh, he's deceased. I can't get an answer from him. But I was just curious, when bankruptcies occur in your system, or for that matter, once products go obsolete, how does that work into your system? How is the central planner going to know that? He's just casting out prices in your system. How is he going to introduce new ones? Oscar? No, forget it. He's dead. Look, state-owned enterprises keep producing negative value added and losses so long as those subsidies are coming in. There's no mechanism for shutting them down. There's no business cycle. The Soviets don't suffer in the Great Depression. They can't. No meaningful signal of failure. The goods are produced, the targets are met, and that's it, until finally the whole system collapses, which is what ultimately happens. So by the 1960s, it's clear that the leaders all understood this. And they knew it probably earlier than that this is not a successful system. They also know they've abandoned any idea that, oh, we're just in a stage and eventually we'll hit communism. They know that that's nonsense. And certainly in the 1960s and by the 1970s, every Soviet citizen knows that that's nonsense. This is it. This is communism. There is no next stage. And at one point, Brezhnev says to his wife, "Dear, I've decided to open the borders with the West." And she says, "Leonid, no, if you do that, why, by evening, there'll only be 2 of us left. Brezhnev says, "You unfaithful woman, I demand to know who this man is you're seeing." This is again why the Soviet sun is so happy in the morning. It knows that by evening it will be in the West. Everybody knows this is a failed system. Children were in one Soviet school were asked to come up and tell stories about their families. They would say, "Tell us about your family and then what you want to do when you grow up." And little Vanushka, he comes up and he says, "Comrade Stalin is my father, and the Soviet motherland is my mother. And when I grow up, I want to be an orphan." Good. Here's a true one. So Don Clark, my instructor, who worked in intelligence, he was at the U.S. Embassy. Everybody at the U.S. Embassy had a Soviet housekeeper assigned to them, and they knew that the housekeeper at the end of every day would go and had to report to the KGB, be debriefed, and it was open. Everybody knew this, and he was talking to his housekeeper, and she was talking, and she said, the Americans all had American, they bring their stuff over from the U.S., so they had an American apartment and things. And she said he had a refrigerator and a freezer. And she said, "Is it true that all Americans have a refrigerator and freezer? Because Soviets in Moscow don't. You didn't have a refrigerator and a freezer." And Don Clark says, "Yes. Yeah, everybody in America has a refrigerator and a freezer." And the housekeeper says, "I thought so. You know what we're told? We're told that you diplomats have so many food shortages in the U.S. that you think it'll be here as well, and so you bring refrigerators and freezers." But we all know it's a lie. Well, this is a failing system. And because of that, it becomes necessary to block the information that people get. They don't want them to hear that things are better elsewhere. They have to keep up a steady stream of propaganda. They have to stop people from leaving. That's why they have to close the borders, because nobody's going to stay in this failed system. And I didn't mention this, but with the, in the Soviet Union, they had a system of internal passports. Why do they have that? Communists just want to control everybody. Well, they do. But why do they institute internal passports that say where you can be? And it's stamped in your passport, where you can be in the country. It's because when they instituted collectivized agriculture, the peasants don't want that, so they all were going to leave and go to the cities. And if everybody leaves, we can't have people deciding where to live. They have to follow the plan. What do? Internal passports. Then when I was teaching in Moscow, this is post-Soviet Union, but I was talking to my students, and we were talking about, I think I had my US passport, and we were talking, and I said, "Gee, I'd like to see one of your Russian passports." And they said, "Oh, sure." Somebody hands me their passport, and I can read Russian. I'm looking at it, and I said, "Wait, this isn't really a passport." And they said, "Oh, you mean a foreign passport. This is the internal passport." Everybody has one. Diplomats. So one of my colleagues, one of the professors at Moscow State University, his parents had been diplomats in the Soviet Union. Similarly, one of my students in Beijing, her parents were diplomats. Both of them told me how they were raised by their grandparents, not their parents. Why? Because the diplomats go abroad, and they're abroad. Well, the system doesn't want them to defect, so they keep the children as hostages. My students are hostages. This professor was a hostage because they didn't want the parents to defect. Think about something like Time magazine, Newsweek magazine. During Soviet times, those were kept under lock and key in special collections, and you had to have a pass from the KGB in order to see those. And that would be suspicious activity if you didn't have a good reason for it. You wouldn't get the pass. Okay. Well, this is a system. Everybody knows, by the 60s and 70s, they understand this. There's growing cynicism. There's falling real incomes, falling life expectancies, growing corruption, there's pollution. I'm going to mostly skip that story. But this is the kind of thing that leads to, well, comrades. What is the intermediate stage between socialism and communism? Alcoholism. It's actually a huge problem. It's a system of cynicism and disgust. They know that there's no transition from socialism to communism. This is it. And Brezhnev dies in 1982. He's replaced by Andropov, who had been the head of the KGB. And he lives a year or two, and then he dies. He's replaced by Chernenko. Chernenko lasts about a year, and he dies. And this is just a mess of a system. Gorbachev comes into power. Gorbachev, basically 88, but Gorbachev comes in, and this will be the final bit of our history because we have the story of perestroika and the ultimate collapse. And perestroika, so we'll call that about 1985 to 1991. That's a Russian word that means restructuring. Gorbachev comes in, and he's a young man, relatively young. He is not someone who grew up under Stalin as one of Stalin's henchmen. And he's a different breed. And so he stages a sort of a revolution. It's not really a revolution, but he basically gets his younger people in and pushes the old Soviet leaders out. He introduces a couple of reforms, and one of them is, of course, this perestroika, and another one is glasnost. Glasnost is a Russian word that means openness. And glasnost means limited freedom of the press and speech. It's limited. But there's some. And people start talking openly about the failures of the economic system and the crimes of the system. Perestroika, restructuring, is this attempt to save the central planning system with economic reform. And the basic story is this: they do not dismantle central planning. They give more freedom to state-owned enterprise managers. And the state-owned enterprise managers have more freedom to make their own decisions. And the first thing they start doing is increasing their theft from the system. I spoke to a state-owned enterprise, had been a state-owned enterprise manager. I can say his name now because he's long since deceased. But Vladimir Kosevich, he was the head of Center Soyuz. He came to power at this time. That company was, that Soviet state-owned enterprise was responsible for 30% of Soviet Union's food production. Huge enterprise. And he said, you know the first thing we started doing? Tunneling. We started funneling resources and wealth off into our own private accounts once we had freedom to do that. This is the period when the Soviet mafias become Russian mafias, really develop. And it is not a successful restructuring. It fails. And this is the time when Soviet economists ask, the big question for us is, how long will the West stand at the brink of economic destruction? Looking down at us. Well, great. End of the USSR comes. There's economic decline. There's failing health, falling life expectancy, pollution. If you're interested in the pollution story, they have the worst pollution problems in the entire world occur in this system. There's a book. It's out of print now, I think, but you can pick it up, probably relatively cheap. It's a great book, Ecocide in the USSR, by an economist, Feshbach, and Friendly is some sort of an environmental scientist. And they document the destruction of the Soviet environment and the negative effects on people's health from this system. It's built into the system to not care about things like that. Well, great. People are demoralized. They're embittered. They're angry about this. If you recall the lectures that we had on Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments about building civic culture, this is a system designed whether it's designed to do this intentionally, it's a system that destroys civic culture. Now, something else is important for our story, and that's the collapse of oil prices. In the 1970s, the Arab nations put on the Arab oil embargo. Countries that supported Israel in the Arab-Israeli wars are boycotted by the Arabs. They were going to cut off your oil supplies, and they cut the amount of oil on the market drastically. The world's #1 exporter of oil at the time is the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, with these high prices on the world market for oil, has foreign currency coming in. And that's one of the ways they keep afloat and finance themselves. It's how they finance their food imports. It's also how they finance their ill-fated war in Afghanistan. 1980s, things changed. The Saudis flood world markets with oil because they're trying to punish OPEC cheaters, and the price of oil collapses. And the Soviets now have lost their cash cow. Great. So that puts great pressure on Gorbachev. Now, there's another part of the story, and you'll sometimes hear it said that Reagan brought down the Soviet Union by our military spending. I mentioned this to a former Soviet guy, and he just looked at me and he said, "You Americans think everything is about you." He thought it was a ridiculous story. Why would they think it's ridiculous? Well, first of all, Soviet military output did not respond to US budgets. They simply produced weapons at the rate that kept their factories at full employment. There's very little flexibility in their budget. And in fact, Yegor Gaidar, he was a Soviet and then Russian economist who's shockingly free. He's a free market advocate. How this happens, miracles. But he's a big free market guy. And he was an advisor to Yeltsin before he passed away at an early age, unfortunately. But he said that Gorbachev, at some point, realizes that this economy is not working well, or that it's much worse than what he thought. And he gets one of his generals who is in charge of the tank production. He says, "Why do we need so many more tanks? We're just cranking them out like crazy." And the general says, "We don't need them. But what would you do? This is a tank factory. You're going to put everybody out of work? It's all we can do. Would you have them producing frying pans? We can't retool. What are you, a utopian?" They can't go bankrupt. They can't retool. An American factory could do that, but they can't. And Gaidar says that Gorbachev began to realize the central planning system is not in anybody's control. It's out of control. It's this thing that's operating by itself, and it's a mess. And drastic reform is necessary. And Gorbachev goes to Reagan. This is an important role of Reagan. And Gorbachev says, "You told me I should tear down that wall. But if I tear it down, what are you going to do? Are you going to have are the NATO armies going to come in and cut our throats?" And Reagan says, "No, go ahead. You can trust us. If you're going to reform, we will leave you alone while you reform." And Reagan stuck to this. Some of his advisors were upset about it, but Reagan was right. And the Soviet bloc, Gorbachev tears down the wall and the Soviet bloc breaks away. It just begins collapsing. The Baltic countries in the Soviet Union are the first to leave. The Russians, the Poland, Hungary, and those places, they break away. They get rid of their communist system. And then the Russians, led by Yeltsin, say, "To hell with the Soviet system," and they abolish it. And in 1991, they abolish the Soviet Union. That supposedly would never happen. It's the happiest historical event in my lifetime. And anytime you think things are dark, these unexpected things can happen. That's every bit as important as the defeat of Nazi Germany, and maybe more so when that system collapses. And they're fools like Putin and some fool at Claremont said disagree, and they think it's a geopolitical tragedy. But it's a great thing that collapses. Great. Well, that brings up the question then about why is it that economists Western economists got this story so wrong? And here's some hypotheses that I have. So let's clean the board for a moment. We'll leave that up. Why did they misunderstand? And my first thought on this is that, number one, there was too much of a focus on equilibrium. Go back to our lecture on competition, the first lecture on competition, where we discuss perfect competition versus rivalrous competition. The notion of perfect competition really was just a description of an equilibrium. But equilibrium stops becoming a tool of analysis for them, and they think it's a description of the world, that there isn't anything else to think about. In equilibrium, though, agents have perfect or complete knowledge, and there's no role for entrepreneurship. So the Soviets don't have entrepreneurship, but who cares? Because that's like we're using an equilibrium model to try to understand, but it really shouldn't be applicable there. Great. What else do they miss? Well, no understanding of the knowledge problem. Go back to our lecture on the socialist calculation debate. Western economists didn't get what Hayek and Mises were talking about. Gosplan planners began to figure it out because they started saying things like, this is documented, that planners said, we actually didn't know. We couldn't tell what was going on in the system, so sometimes we would just give so much resources to this branch and less to this branch, and then next period we'd reverse it just to see what happened. We really couldn't tell. This is what they say. They're shooting in the dark. They don't understand what's going on. Without market prices, the planners are truly blind. They don't know what the opportunity costs of any action are. What else? A poor understanding of incentives. This is what's plaguing the Western economists. They start focusing just on that and they miss everything. A poor understanding of incentives, well, in equilibrium, the incentive problems have been solved. Capital and labor have been allocated optimally. It's equilibrium. And in equilibrium, why government, by assumption, acts to maximize social welfare, by assumption. What if that's not what they're doing? What if they're maximizing their own personal utility and they don't have good information and they don't care? We didn't put that into our models. Why would utility maximizing people behave the way that the equilibrium says? What are the constraints that get us there? Well, that's the fourth thing. They either underestimate or poorly understand the role of institutions. Property rights and institutions. The rules of the game. Because in equilibrium, that's already been solved. Here, look at this. Let's clear this for a moment. Here's what do I want to put on my graph? Let's try, well, sure, we'll do. There's output per worker, and there's capital per worker. And great, there's our production function. And that tells us if we've optimally allocated everything, then that, according to this, that comes from our production function. Output equals a function of capital and labor. great. The solo growth model could be put in here. In fact, in the solo growth model, it takes a Cobb-Douglas form of a k to the alpha, l to the 1 minus alpha, or whatever we want for our exponents. Great, there's the solo growth model. What does solo say? Well, that's it. Really, why is that? Why do we think that we're going to allocate these things optimally? And what affects that? And ultimately, solo ends up saying, oh, that actually includes institutions. Oh, good. Where are they in your model? You've assumed the correct incentives and knowledge and things like that, but you didn't model them, you didn't put them into your theory. This is where Western economists have fallen short. So you look at someone like Paul Samuelson, who had said that the Soviet system was superior. It's because he had nothing but mathematical models of optimization and equilibrium, exclusively, nothing else. Then they did econometric analysis of easily measured variables, prices, quantities of stuff. That's easy to measure. And they skipped all the serious problems of uncertainty, knowledge, strategic behavior, disequilibrium processes in institutions and property rights. And as you can see, this whole experience undercuts that paradigm. The failure of central planning brings this to the fore. And by 1990s, economists are not saying institutions don't matter. They can't say that anymore. You just sound stupid when you say that. And this, we see something else that's going to happen. And it really begins in the 1960s and before. But that's the rise of new institutional economics. And so that'll be the next story that we tell. That will come from Ronald Coase, who will talk about why institutions, what they are, and why they matter, and the crucial role of property rights. So we're going to pick up with that. But that does raise a few more questions. And the first question is, Karl Marx called this scientific socialism. But the question, comrades, is communism a scientific system? Why, no. If it were a scientific system, it would have been tried out on dogs first. What's the world's shortest joke? Communism. What's the world's longest joke? 70 years of Soviet communism.